And, I noticed also too that you had some great teachers growing up as well, right?
I did indeed. I did not love school. I think I was like many students who felt somewhat bored in many classes that I saw no relevance for. But I do remember my second grade teacher was very helpful to me. I'm a left-handed, and learning to write cursive, she frequently held up my paper as an example of a good cursive or good penmanship. And that was encouraging because I always felt a little bit different. I'm glad nobody tried to change me to be a right-hander, but Mrs. Walcott was a great encouragement. And then I have another vivid recollection of my high school government teacher, Mr. Ron Pothoven. He was great. He inspired a curiosity around our nation's founding and all of the civics underlying our nation's organization. And little did I know that that class and that interest there would ultimately lead me to a lifetime of involvement in politics and in policy. But he was very informative as well.
Well, speaking about your involvement in, involvement in policy, actually kind of one of your early experiences with giving children more options in educations involves something called the Potter's House, which I thought was very interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about that school and how it impacted your view about what education could be for children, especially those who are underserved by the regular public schools, and how it also impacted your later school choice work?
Sure. Well, I came across the Potter's House when I was looking at various school options for our then oldest son, Rick, starting kindergarten. And so it was many years ago now. It was 35 years ago. He's 40 plus. And I discovered the Potter's House, a small urban Christian school in the heart of our city, the heart of the Grand Rapids. It had been founded by a number of students who graduated from the same college that I had. And they started this school to serve children in that heart, that heart community, most of whom could not afford to attend a Christian school or a faith-based, tuition-based school. So this group really raised the funds to operate the school. 90% of the funds every year, still do today, by the way. But we didn't ultimately choose that school for Rick, but I got involved as a volunteer and started mentoring students. Dick and I started supporting students to be able to go there or giving scholarships to families. But the more I got involved there, the more I realized that for every child and every family represented there were probably 10 or 20 other families in that neighborhood that would have loved to have their children in a place like the Potter's House. And so I started getting involved from the policy perspective then, just saying it's not fair that these families don't have the same kind of choices and options that Dick and I do, simply because they can't afford it. And so that was really the genesis of my work around policy and then the politics to change policy now 35 years ago.
When you volunteered at the Potter's House and you were helping these kids who come from underprivileged backgrounds, what kinds of differences did you see, like between what the Potter's House was offering, in their curriculum, maybe their learning model, versus what they would have gotten, for example, if they had been forced to simply attend a regular public school?
Well, for one thing, they started with high expectations. They expected that every child coming there was capable of learning and that they were going to do that. And secondly, it is such a warm and nurturing, safe environment, warm and nurturing in particular. You just walk into the school and you have a feel for those who are there, who are absolutely dedicated to doing the best they can for the students there. And it's just, it really is an amazing and invigorating and nurturing environment for the kids who attend. Interestingly, at that time, and I don't think it's much different today, but there's a traditional public elementary school about 2 blocks away from the Potter's House. And at the time I started getting involved there, this particular school was it was in the bottom 1% of all schools in the state of Michigan. And so again, families wanted something better for their kids. And the Potter's House is an example of a place that provides better. And in addition to providing better and higher expectations and a higher quality of education, it's also an environment that matches the values of the families whose children are there.
That's terrific. Well, we could spend the whole time talking about all your interesting history, both family and how you got involved in politics. But let's fast forward though to 2016. And you write in your book that you were actually surprised both when Donald Trump won the presidency, and even more surprised when you were asked to seriously consider the possibility of becoming Secretary of Education. Could you tell us about that year and how you came to be the U.S. Secretary of Education?
Certainly. Well, yes, I had started out that whole presidential campaign cycle, supporting initially Jeb Bush, who's been a longtime friend and ally in the fight for education freedom. And when Jeb's candidacy didn't continue, I was very open to what next. But I was really interested to hear then candidate Trump start talking openly about advocating for school choice, using the term school choice. I like to talk about education freedom, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later. But he openly advocated for a program that would support families to be able to make the choice of where their children go to school. That was my first recollection of a presidential candidate who did so very openly. And so I was very, interested in that. Very soon after the election, I was actually contacted by Jeb. The next day, he emailed me and asked, would you ever consider being Secretary of Education? And literally till I read those words, the thought had never crossed my mind. So long story short, in a very short sequence of events, I talked with then Vice President-elect Pence, who had also been a longtime friend and ally. I think Jeb and he had talked, and he, asked me if I would come in and talk with President-elect Trump about that possibility. And so I was honored to do that and excited to do that, because I thought we might really have an opportunity to advance these policies in ways that we had never dreamt of before at the federal level, and to raise the awareness and raise the support for policies to support families. And so it was really a very short period of time, like about 2 weeks after the election, that then President-elect Trump called and asked me to serve.
Well, I loved how he, in your book, he calls up and says, well, you're just basically a very short call.
You're going to make a great Secretary of Education.
Which I thought was terrific. I mean, just out of curiosity, and I don't want you to say anything that is confidential or anything, but initially when you talk, everybody has to interview with the president-elect for a cabinet position. What was your conversation generally like?
It was all around the work that I had done for the 30 years at that time to advance these policies to support families, and also around support for the notion that we've got to talk more broadly and support more broadly other options beyond high school for students other than a four-year college or university. Culturally, we have suggested or implied for several decades now that if you don't go to college, you're somehow not as good as or second best. And I have always been very anti that emotion, because there are so many other really important and viable paths for young people to take. And we haven't been doing a good job of exposing kids at an early age to a wide variety or wide range of options and opportunities. And President-elect Trump was very, very aligned with that as well. And we spent a lot of time talking about career and technical education and alternative apprenticeships, internships, alternative pathways beyond high school as important options that we needed to support. And so that was another significant part of the conversation. But there were, a number of people who are in the room that were asking questions, but it was all around, what do we do to help students? Because our the results we're getting for the money we're spending in this country simply don't match up, and it's not right for students and their futures.
No, and I'm glad to hear that there was so much emphasis on career technical education. Myself, having spent time as president of the Board of Governors for the California Community College System, I mean, our community college system here in our state is really the main provider for career technical education to kids. And, employers just can't get enough of our graduates with our certificates in the various fields. And I think people forget about that you can get a certificate in a career technical education field and earn incredible money right out the door.
Well, and also we know that there are millions of jobs going unfilled today that require some kind of education beyond high school, but not a 4-year degree. And there really has not been a concerted effort to bring the private sector, the businesses together who have these needs with educators to say, how can we actually meet the demand today for relevant jobs today? And how can we phase out ones that no longer have relevance? I'm sure, having been involved in the community college system, you saw firsthand that there were places where people held on to courses of study that really no longer are relevant to today's job market. And yet, there's so many opportunities to do what needs to be done to address those demands and prepare young people today for those opportunities.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, the dynamism of today's economy is so amazing, and people need to really recognize that and kind of basically get with the program. But to go from dynamism on one hand to something on the total opposite end of the spectrum, one of the revealing chapters you have in your book is called The Swamp. And I thought that was a really interesting chapter to read. We hear that term all the time, the swamp. But as secretary, you experienced kind of all aspects of it, from entrenched bureaucrats to shocking leaks of information, to grandstanding Democrats like Senator Dick Durbin, to status quo Republicans like Senator Lisa Murkowski. Could you tell us about how wide and deep the swamp is in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I was often asked, what was the biggest surprise when you became Secretary of Education? And I said, and I still say with great honesty, I knew going into a large federal bureaucracy that things would be bureaucratic and difficult. I underestimated how bureaucratic and how difficult things would be. The bureaucracy at the Department of Education, and I'm sure it's true of other federal agencies, is very oriented to itself. It is not oriented to serving students. One of the things that I insisted on and did with my team was try to redirect everything that we did around what was right for students, and orienting all of our policy and discussion around doing the right thing for them. That was very difficult. And there were quite a few people within the department that were wonderful career civil servants that actually supported and helped in our goals of serving students. There were a lot of others who thwarted in many ways and would put up roadblocks. And the book goes through a number of examples that were very telling about that. When we talk about the swamp, it is very wide and deep, and it is very isolated and insulated from what the rest of the world is. And my husband was great when I started the job in insisting very regularly that I come home to Michigan as many times on weekends as I possibly could, so that I could be back in the real world. And I appreciate his insistence on that, because it was very true. You could get very, very fixated on things in in Washington, D.C. that do not relate to or have any resonance with people who are actually living their lives, going about their daily activities, and putting food on the table and roof over their head for their kids.
Well, one of the things that you did as secretary was, I mean, you and the administration proposed that a lot of these programs that had no real research basis, no evidence that they had worked to improve the performance and achievement of children, that they needed to be eliminated. And I actually, in my position here at Pacific Research Institute, I actually wrote in support of those eliminations of those types of programs that were both a huge waste of money and not helping the people that they were intended to help. And yet, it was so difficult, to get those cuts through the Congress because, so much support, unfortunately, had grown up around these programs, despite the fact that there was no evidence to show that the children were being helped. Could you talk just a tad about that?
Yes, well, there are so many things that are done within the Department of Education simply because that's always the way they've been done. And trying to change them and put in different criteria or parameters was difficult in many cases, in most cases, and impossible in others. I actually proposed budgets the last 2 years that would have block granted all of the funds from the department, other than ones that were specifically designated under the law by Congress, back to the states. Because what has happened within the department is you have all these hundreds, thousands of people who work to sort of machinate around these grants and competitive opportunities, but they'll weight them around their philosophical leanings, and instead of doing what the right thing for students at the local level. And my feeling is that when you get closest to the students, you're going to get the best answers. And so we proposed essentially doing away with that whole bureaucracy in the middle that does nothing more than push paper around and add points to areas that line up with them philosophically. And I said many times then, and it's gotten more attention recently, I really do not think the Department of Education has a role. And I think it should cease to exist. It can be wound down, and there is a way to do it. And I think there is a serious case to be made that it should be phased out, because it was stood up in 1979 as a payoff to the teachers' unions by Jimmy Carter, who got their endorsement the first time the teachers' unions endorsed a presidential candidate in '76. This was a political payoff to the teachers' unions, and it has continued to take local and family and those closest to the students' decision making away, and has centralized it in Washington in ways that has been very unhealthy for students. Only 8 or 9% of the funding for education in K-12 education comes from the federal level. And yet all these different strings come attached to all the monies that come out of that department. And so I think there is a very strong case to be made for that to be phased out. And let's let if Congress wants to continue to expend those resources, let's let those funds go to the families that are most in need of directing their kids.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Betsy. There is nothing in the Constitution that talks about federal control over education. It's all supposed to be left for the states and the localities, parents, and the federal government should not have a role. It certainly should not be the tail wagging the education dog in America.
Right. Right. I mean, we spend roughly $750 billion on K-12 education every year. And that's, roughly $15,000 per student. Think about if we attached, and I use the metaphor of a backpack, attach that to the child's backpack for their family to direct where their child was going to receive their education. many families would be able to customize, pick and choose where they got different parts and pieces from. Others would choose to send their children to a school like the Potter's House, or name any other kind of a setting or venue. And those who are happy in the school to which they're assigned would not have any reason to leave. And frankly, they could count on their schools actually getting better, because schools would make changes that they refuse to make today because they don't have something to compare themselves to. They don't have competition. We look no further than Florida, where there have been several definitive studies around this showing that where higher percentages of kids are choosing schools other than their assigned school, all of the students in that area, in that district, are doing better, including the ones who stay in their assigned schools.
That's right. Rising tide raises all boats, right? And so, I mean, actually, I think that's a great segue into, my next question, which is actually about school choice or education freedom. It's always been one of your main passions. I remember watching the fascinating school choice roundtable that was held at the White House that included you and Governor Ron DeSantis, my friend, teacher Rebecca Friedrichs, and others. Could you tell us about how you promoted school choice and education freedom during your time as secretary, and what impact that had, in this country?
Sure. Well, I talked about it all the time, and it was certainly not without controversy for those who are protectors and defenders of the system and the status quo. All of the visits that I did as secretary were to schools that that were doing something differently than the traditional, industrial 175-year-old model. Many traditional public schools who were doing things slightly differently. One example being a school I visited in Casper, Wyoming, where the whole district in that Casper was contained in was actually a choice district. And there were different schools that had adjusted their approach and their focus to accommodate different kinds of student needs. So one of them, the one that I visited, was an elementary school, bled into a little bit of middle school, I think, but it was totally teacher and parent led and run, and the grades were blended, or there was a very blurred line between grades. It was much more of a mastery based approach. Again, very different than most traditional public schools. Another school I visited in Lincoln, Nebraska, that most of the day was at the students came to the zoo to do their learning at the zoo and in and around that environment. So I tried to visit places that were doing things differently to show that there's benefit and there's appeal for students to be able to have different choices and different menus of options, because they are all different. They learn differently. And so that was a theme the entire time I was in office. And then every chance I got in speaking, I would talk about the necessity for empowering families to make choices in ways that so many are not today. I think that, frankly, the 2 years we've experienced with COVID and all of the ramifications from that, be it the overly long shutdowns of schools, the mask mandates, the front row seat parents had in their children's education to see what they were learning, or in many cases, what they weren't learning. Whether it was offensive curriculum, inappropriate curriculum, or a lack of high quality and robustness, parents and families saw the deficiencies that I had seen many, many years before. And so this conversation about education freedom and school choice has gained momentum like we never could have anticipated before the COVID months struck. But I think that the importance of having a bully pulpit, like being a cabinet member, and having a president who regularly talked about this issue broadly, was very helpful. Frankly, we could have done more to push for the federal tax credit that we had raised up as an opportunity. And I think I know there's ongoing efforts to continue to gain support for that kind of legislation at the federal level now.
And I think that, you make so many great points. Certainly the one size fits all that we see in the regular public school systems, don't meet the individual needs of kids, because as you point out, every child is different. I thought one of the great things about your book is that you actually detail so many different types of schools that you visited. Schools with all kinds of different learning models that appeal to different children and who had different needs. And so, maybe say a few words about it. When we talk about school choice, people think that, well, this is only for certain types of children who would benefit by a school choice program. When in reality, I mean, you and I and all those who have been promoting school choice for so many years understand that it is something that will work for kids, across the spectrum of children, especially in cases with children with special needs, who are often the ones who are left out of a one-size-fits-all type of education system.
Yeah, absolutely. And a great example of the importance of giving all families that opportunity. I'm reminded of my friends Samuel and Tara Meyer. I think Tara almost single-handedly was able to get the Education Freedom School Choice legislation passed in the state of Ohio a number of years ago to benefit children like her son Samuel, who has Down syndrome. And there was such a beautiful moment at this roundtable in the White House on school choice, where Samuel read his handwritten letter about what he wanted to do, what some of his goals were, and how grateful he was to have found a school that worked for him and that was nurturing and encouraging and supportive of his needs. And it was just a very poignant moment, an example of what we need for all kids to be able to access opportunities like that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I remember that moment with Samuel, watching that, and it was an amazing moment. Brought tears to your eyes, actually. And so, we talk about different schools. I thought one of the fascinating parts of your book was when I read that you actually took a joint tour of schools with, of all people, Randy Weingarten, the very liberal head of the American Federation for Teachers. Could you tell us about that tour?
Sure.
And what are your thoughts about the role of the teachers unions as they play in education policy making and their influence that they have over that policy making, especially amongst both Democrats and also too, which I'm sure some people would be surprised to learn, over Republicans as well?
Well, on my first day in office, I called both Randy Weingarten and then the head of the NEA, Lily Eckelson Garcia. I spoke with Randy and I said, I know that there are areas on which we disagree, but I'm sure that we can find common ground and we could do things on behalf of students together. And I suggested that she come and visit a school with me. And she agreed to do that. We mutually agreed to visit a school together. I first agreed to visit a school of her choosing. And we visited a small town in Van Wert, Ohio, and had a very nice visit. It was a traditional school, but in a very small rural town. And I think she probably chose it thinking that this was a town which was very supportive of their traditional public school. It was it brought into focus the reluctance of some rural legislators, many of whom are often Republican, and the reluctance of rural legislators to support the notion of education freedom and school choice because they don't think it's applicable for kids in their communities. And So the visit with Randy, it was a nice visit. She never found the time to schedule a visit of my choosing, unfortunately. But I think this notion that, well, first of all, the teachers' unions, and I refer to them more broadly as school unions, because I don't think they really represent teachers, not very well, at least. But they do represent a broadening group of people that they keep sweeping into their membership. And they really do exist to continue to support the system, the status quo, and the power that they have amassed. And they have amassed a huge amount of power. And with all their allied groups, I call them the alphabet soup of groups. Every one of them has major operations and offices in Washington. And that's where it's all, headquartered. That's where the center of power is for K-12 education that is focused on adults and adult issues. And I think they have been the largest impediment to children and their futures. And frankly, also to many teachers and their futures. And we've seen that play out in many different ways this last couple of years. The failings that they have, that continued to not serve students and are now trying to turn around and suggest that it was others who were politicizing the moment rather than them. But they have been the biggest impediment. They have supported elected officials that will pledge their fealty to the union's agenda and demands, and it has been to the detriment of children, and that has been pointed out and has been revealed in ways that folks had not really realized before a couple of years ago.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I certainly think that's the case here in California, where, here in our state capital, the state teachers unions are the 800-pound gorillas who are basically blocking any type of real education reform. And it's to the detriment of the students, to the children.
Absolutely.
When anything from, blocking school choice initiatives to even things such as eliminating testing and things like that, which, of course, ends up hurting kids because you don't really know how well they're doing until it's too late. And so I think that we're seeing dumbing down of academic rigor in our state and our country. And a lot of that has to do with the teachers' unions.
Absolutely. And, I'll reference my book and just speak to the title, which is provocative by design, Hostages No More. But it's a direct reference to a quote made by Horace Mann, commonly known as the father of the K-12 education system, who 175 years ago, when the system was founded, said that educators are entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. And parents saw that this last couple of years. They are seeing it yet today. And so, this is the time and the moment for families to take back their opportunities to direct and control their kids' education and futures in ways that I think they thought they had a lot more control over, but their experiences through COVID have really revealed that they don't. And this is the time for them to say, we need to have other options. We need to have other choices for our children's education and learning experiences.
No, absolutely right. And well, let's talk a bit about that then. Let's talk about today, after the time you were secretary. So a lot has happened in the last 2 years, as we've been chatting about. So could you give us kind of your broad overview of the current American education landscape? I mean, we've mentioned the 2 years of COVID, and we've seen how the country's public school systems mostly have not been up to the task of getting kids through this difficult time without huge learning losses. I mean, we're seeing in research coming out of McKinsey and other organizations showing that as kids are maybe a half a year of learning loss in the basic subjects, and even more so if you're looking at low-income kids. And so, tell us about what your views are about this current landscape.
Well, and I think of your state of California, where some kids were kept out of school for 2 years, literally, and the tremendously negative impact that has on them academically, and then what it's had on them socially and mentally. And I don't think we're going to know for a number of years yet how deep and dramatic these impacts are, which calls for an even more expedited move toward giving families the ability to get their kids to a place where they can get going again academically and mentally and emotionally. But the impact on kids, especially on the kids who could least afford to be out of school, is indescribable. And where we go from here has to be oriented around supporting policy that will support families and kids to get in a place where it is going to work for them. We have seen 26 states expand or adopt some kind of an education freedom program in the last year and a half. There are more states poised and ready to do it. We just saw the state of Arizona. Governor Ducey signed a law the legislature sent him that will create a statewide universal education savings account program. Every child in Arizona, if their assigned school is not working for them, they can take 90% of what the state spends for that child and buy their education wherever they think it's going to work best for them. And they can change if it doesn't work out. They have the freedom to go and use the marketplace to find creative solutions. I visited Arizona in the late summer of 2020 when the hope was that schools across the country would be figuring out ways to get their students back in person. And we know all too well how many failed to do that. But I visited with Governor Ducey, and we talked with and met with a number of educators and parents who had basically taken things into their own hands and had started what some are referring to as learning pods or micro schools, basically a hybrid or a 21st century one-room schoolhouse with multiple age kids and a teacher that was hired in to help make sure these kids continued to learn. Those kinds of opportunities are still thriving today. And in fact, there's a great demand to continue to grow them. And so Arizona is going to continue to be on the forefront of advancing these kinds of choices and menus of options for families there. I think many other states are going to be looking very hard at what happens there, and they're going to be compelled to move ahead with their own kinds of programs. I know in Michigan here, we're on the verge of getting an education savings account program established for many of the families. It's going to help thousands and thousands of families in Michigan. This is really the answer for the future.
It's almost like your life has almost come a little bit full circle, because when you thought about having a potter's house for every child, now it's actually coming to fruition in so many states.
That's right. That's right. No, the possibilities are there, and we just have to make sure that all of us who've been advocating for these policies for a long time continue to put gas on the fire and ensure that legislators and governors and our federal officials actually can consider the tax credit route so that that can come in alongside the states that are doing this on behalf of their kids.
No, that's right. Now, you reference parents. A really important part of your book are the chapters that are aimed at parents. For example, you discussed the great parental awakening that's occurring in this country right now. So tell us about this parent revolution that is going on in our nation, the reasons why it's occurring, such as the explosion of critical race theory in the classroom, and any other reasons that you think are fueling this fire.
Well, I think we saw a real life living example of this in the governor's race last year in Virginia, when then previous Governor Terry McAuliffe said famously at a parent or a town hall forum that he didn't think parents should be involved in their children's schools or education. And many thought that he just had made a slip up and that he would, backtrack and recover from that. But instead, he doubled down. And conversely, Glenn Youngkin, the underdog Republican candidate, said, no, parents have to have a voice and they have to have a say in their kids' education. And this became the real defining issue in that race. I think it is a microcosm of what is going on elsewhere in the country today. And we're seeing it, we're seeing it in state legislative races. We're seeing it in congressional races. We're seeing it in governor's races. And the reality is that 3 out of 4 Americans say parents should be able to make these decisions and choices for their children. And that has that number has continued to grow dramatically since before COVID. And so those are the kinds of opportunities that we have to build on. And I think I know that the campaigns this fall many of them are going to be run around this issue. I know just in primary races a few weeks ago in the state of Iowa, Governor Kim Reynolds, who has long been trying to get a education freedom provision passed in Iowa, had some reluctant Republican rural legislators who refused to support her initiative. Well, she took the rather unconventional step of endorsing a number of opponents in the primaries of those who refused to support her. And I believe the number was winning 8 out of the 9 in which she engaged. So it goes to show this is an issue that is on the rise, and parents have to be able to seize this moment and do the things that are going to support their children and their school, their education communities, and be able to put their children and maybe form a new school or align with a great teacher who wants to do something different. And this is one thing I want to say for teachers, the notion of education freedom is a freeing opportunity for them to be recognized and appreciated and supported and celebrated in their important roles, because there's nothing more important in the equation than having a great teacher. And I know there's so many teachers who have left the profession because they feel so beaten down by a system that refuses to change, a system that didn't respond in the last 2 years, that was so politicized in favor of adult issues and against kids. This is a very freeing opportunity for teachers as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And the great thing about your chapters on parents is that it's not just kind of a general support that you give to parents, but you actually put out there an actual parent agenda. At the end of your book, you have a chapter called "What's a Parent to Do?" And you list a number of action items that parents can engage in, anywhere from reclaiming their role as the primary educator for their children, to demanding education freedom, to asking to see their children's curriculum, to running for the school board. So could you talk to us about your parent empowerment agenda and how that really fits this time where we see so much energy on the part of parents now to want to affect change?
Well, there are so many things that parents, grandparents, concerned friends and neighbors can do to advance this broad agenda, but it starts with focusing on the necessity for parents to be able to direct and control their kids' education, including the resources for their kids' education. So starts with really holding their legislators accountable and their governor accountable for supporting this. And then it also extends to if you love the school your child is at, but you have some problems with how the board is operating it, go and run for school board and get engaged that way. But you have other options, in that you can get together with a bunch of other families and start this 21st century one-room schoolhouse, which is proving to be so compelling for so many families in the most unexpected places. The number of homeschoolers, self-reported homeschoolers, has more than doubled in the last year, and that is going to only continue to rise. So this is a time to really make sure that their parents' voices are heard and respected, and that in that you will ultimately have the ability to choose where is the best education setting for your child. I mentioned before, the system we've been operating under for 175 years was based on an industrial model where the inputs were very different, children very different, but the intention was that the output is the same, that children come out the other end all looking and behaving and acting the same way. Well, we've seen the perils of that and the downsides of that in many different ways the last few years. The notion that education as an industry is the least disrupted industry in our country is one that some will quarrel with me and say it's not, well, education's not an industry. Well, it is an industry, and it has more of an infrastructure as an industry than many other industries do. And yet it has had the least amount of creativity and ingenuity and entrepreneurship applied to it. And it's with the most important assets we have, our children. They are our future. And so let's do everything we can to get policy to support parents' ability to direct this, and creative people's ability to enter this and provide different kinds of learning environments and options to unlock our kids' potentials.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, Betsy. Right now I'm actually, writing a book along with a couple of co-authors, Wen-Yuan Wu and Mackenzie Richards, and we're it's looking at this critical race theory issue in our country, but from the parents' perspective. So we profile parents and students, school board members and educators who are basically on the front lines of this battle in the classroom. And one of the things that I was just amazed at in talking to these parents, for example, is just what they're doing to overcome this great education behemoth that they're faced with. I mean, anywhere from filing lawsuits to filing Freedom of Information or Public Records Act requests to obviously attending school boards meetings, running for school boards themselves. I mean, they are having to do so much heavy lifting, and yet I think because of COVID and other things, they've seen just how bad things are right now in the education swamp, and are therefore really motivated to actually change the very nature of how we are going to provide education in this country.
Absolutely. And like I said, I think these offensive curriculums that parents weren't aware were being taught, and they have been for a number of years, that it's reaching a boiling point now, but these have been seeded and a part of the equation for a lot longer than we like to admit or acknowledge. But now that that's all been exposed, parents have every right to say, I don't want this for my child. I don't want my child to be taught to hate him or herself because of who they are or how they're born. We need to, conversely, we need to teach the truth, and we need to teach our children how to respect and engage one another in conversation, and the debate about ideas, and how to do so in ways that are going to build people up, not tear them down.
No, that's absolutely right. You referenced previously the phenomenon we're seeing in homeschooling. And, I just actually, wrote a book myself called The Homeschool Boom. And, as you point out, you see, depending on the numbers you look at, homeschooling has increased, either doubled or tripled, and in particular communities, for example, African
Yes.
Americans. I mean, you've
Yes.
seen quintupling
Quintupled. Yes.
of homeschooling in those communities. And so, it's obvious that those different communities and America at large, the parents are seeing that, first of all, because of COVID, that the schools were not providing the type of education learning program that was going to be effective with their kids, and parents were having to supplement the education of their children. And then they found out that actually, why am I having to supplement the regular public schools who are doing a terrible job, but why don't I just simply do this myself? And so you're seeing this incredible rise in homeschooling. So, I think it's not just a blip. I think it's going to be a trend. And you point out the pandemic pods. There's so many different types of variations of homeschooling models out there now. What do you see upcoming in America, our education landscape 10, 20 years from now, given these types of trends?
Well, I really do think it's hard for us to fully envision what could be when the creativity and ingenuity is applied to a marketplace where families can control their kids' education, because we haven't known it, we haven't seen it. Now, we can see it to some extent in the higher education world, except I would say that there's a lot about the higher ed world that has begun to ossify and sort of paralyze in many ways. But when you think about, freeing creative people to really untap the learning potential of every child, the different ways of approaching it are just myriad. And I think about a little school that I'm aware of in West Michigan where I live. I haven't visited it yet, but it's just one small example. I live in Michigan, so it's cold in the winter, very cold. But this school is an outdoor school where the kids are outdoors for their learning all day, every day, year round. Middle of the winter, rain, sleet, snow, or shine, and they want to be there. There's a waiting list of kids who want to go there, and there's teachers who want to teach in that environment. And so I think I use that as an example of thinking more broadly about how and where we can learn, and that it doesn't have to be in a specific building for X number of days a year and this amount of time sitting behind a desk. Kids should be able to learn mastering the materials and moving on as quickly as they can or as they are able, or taking as much time as they need. And they could do it in a whole variety of settings. And, I think about, there's a couple of schools that I'm aware of where the whole city is basically their classroom, right? I mean, I think about a city like Washington, D.C., where you've got just endless resources to go and use as the actual classroom for the day, in museums and art galleries, and the possibilities are limitless. The same is true in almost every setting. And I think about what is relevant for kids in the state of Alaska, where I visited, and I visited a very remote village up in the Arctic Circle, and what is relevant for kids in the city of Miami. And yet we have a system that basically says you in Alaska are going to learn the same way as you in Miami. And why is that? It doesn't make sense, but it's what we know, and it's how we've done it. So we have to think more broadly about what learning experiences can look like for kids based on what their environment is and what their resources are around them, and how that might, just untap and unleash potential that we wouldn't get to in the traditional approach.
Well, I couldn't think of a better way to end our webinar. Secretary DeVos, Betsy, it's been such a great pleasure to have you on with us here at the Pacific Research Institute. We've been great friends for many years, And it's great to have this conversation with you, talking about the future of education. And to all of those who have been watching our webinar, I want to thank you for being on today. I would highly recommend Betsy DeVos's book, Hostages No More: The Fight for Education Freedom and the Future of the American Child. Thank you very much, Secretary DeVos.
Thanks so much, Lance. I've enjoyed being with you, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone.